Okay, this should be interesting. So this is human language gene inserted into mice led to some bizarre effects by Anton Petrov. I'm curious to see what happens.
This is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a somewhat intriguing and somewhat unusual experiment. An experiment involving mice that were genetically modified to have one single gene to be exactly the same as the one inside humans. And this produced results scientists are still trying to understand. And here, this gene that generates a protein known as NOVA1 may potentially explain why humans can communicate the way we communicate and might have created our ability to produce complex ideas and to verbalize a lot of our thoughts. And so let's talk about this somewhat unusual but somewhat exciting experiment in a little bit more detail and talk about some of the potential ramifications.
Yes, tell me,
Now, as
Anton.
always, you can find the study itself in the description below. And here, the study by Yoko Tajima basically focused on a somewhat unknown protein known as NOVA1. It's a protein that binds to RNA molecules encoded by the NOVA1 gene. And in essence, sort of looks like this. And though like many other genes and many other proteins, it seems to be responsible for a lot of different functions. Inside the brain, it seems to be responsible for neural development. As a matter of fact, all of the previous studies about this gene were mostly studying this gene because it seems to be associated with a lot of different brain disorders, specifically when it has some kind of a problem. But by itself, this NOVA1 gene is also known as master gene regulator. You can essentially think of it as a kind of a master switch, and so any problem with the NOVA gene results in some serious issues. You can actually learn about this gene and its functions from one of the studies from 2014 that you can find in the description. But surprisingly, it does seem to affect at least 90% of all human genes in some way or another. But most of the interest in the last few years was really in regards to its effects on the brain. Because scientists discovered that when it creates this NOVA1 protein, this can then rearrange sections of RNA inside neurons, making them form in a very different way, making them create certain structures and develop in certain ways.
Interesting.
Now,
So, too many ads.
just 2 years ago, that essentially discovers that it seems to regulate very specific activity inside hypothalamus, with any change to this protein affecting our brain and hypothalamus in somewhat serious ways. And so the overall conclusion from many of these studies is basically that this unusual gene changes how our brain cells seem to synthesize proteins, and thus changes how our neurons develop. And one of the main conclusions here is that it seems to dramatically increase molecular diversity inside neurons. And naturally, because this gene is so important, it does not just exist in humans. As a matter of fact, it looks like most mammals, or possibly even all mammals, seem to contain NOVA1 inside their genes. And obviously, because this is a master gene, this should not come as a surprise. It would explain why so many mammals develop in very similar ways, and even have somewhat similar brain structures. Except that there is a very small side note here. Of all of the mammals in nature, looks like human NOVA1 gene has one tiny difference. It literally has a single amino acid that's different in human version compared to other mammals.
Really?
Here, inside the position 197, the isoleucine amino acid has now been changed to valine, which
Wow, he's doing a great job. I'm really enjoying this.
though might not be a big deal, completely changes the protein in humans compared to other mammals, at least in terms of its structure. And because of this bizarre difference, for many years now, some researchers speculated that maybe this is actually something that makes us very different, and specifically, maybe this is something that gave us speech. So
That would be crazy if it's just a single gene that turns on speech. I mean, that... Is it like a kill switch that's just like... The kill switch is turned on in all other animals, and just for humans, boop.
for the past few years, NOVA1 has actually been the so-called language gene contender, because only humans seem to have this specific form. But this was somewhat debatable because previously, in a lot of different studies, a slightly different gene was a better contender. A gene you see right here known as FOXP2, or fork hat box protein P2.
That looks messy.
A gene expressed inside the brain, the heart, the lungs, and the digestive system that also exists in a lot of different vertebrates.
Why is the DNA so sparkly?
And intriguingly, one of the experiments back in the days revealed that when this gene is introduced into mice, they actually start to speak.
Shh, careful, Petrov. There's a mouse behind you, a giant white mouse.
Speak differently, or technically squeak differently. This was reported back in 2009, And here the human version of this gene made the mice produce slightly different sounds. Although here it also produced some additional bizarre behaviors. For
Wow.
example, the mice were not as curious anymore and did not feel as much joy because for some reason their brain was not producing as much dopamine. Nevertheless, this experiment and this study was actually
It's like, we are less curious and have less joy than mice. Is that what you're saying, Anton? Is that where this is going? Humans are fundamentally nihilistic creatures.
exciting just because this was achieved and because it was now possible to test other genes just to see if we can discover this language gene and communication gene that in essence makes us human. Although when it comes to this
So we're like anhedonic. Is that right? Is that the right word? Anhedonic? No, what was the word? I'll come back to it.
FOXP2 gene, based on the analysis of Neanderthals and Denisovans, or essentially our cousins from back in the days, they also seem to have this gene as well, and it was very similar to the one in humans, which
How would you know that? I actually don't know. Do we have Neanderthal DNA?
back in the days implied that maybe Neanderthals could also speak like humans. And one of the reasons scientists actually thought that FOXP2 was a language gene was because of the disorders associated with the problems inside this gene. Anyone that has a mutation in this gene very often has a lot of speech defects and is unable to move their lips and their mouth in order to produce any speech.
What?
Defect inside this gene. Anyone that has a mutation in this gene very often has a lot of speech defects and is unable to move their lips and their mouth in order to produce any speech. Likewise,
Wow, so if you have a mutation in that one gene, wow. Wow, it really seems to be a kill switch, right?
compared to other mammals,
I mean, I can't imagine like the single gene on its own produces all of this speech, but it seems to be the capacity for speech is built into the rest of the RNA or DNA or whatever. But if it's just a single gene, then that gene can act as a kill switch. And so it's interesting how that is really weird. So, that gives a lot to think about.
the human FOXP2 gene is just a little bit different, but is exactly the same as the one inside Neanderthals. And so this was thought to be the origin of human language. But naturally, this was just the beginning, and obviously scientists wanted to keep looking just to see if we can find other contenders or discover something else.
Damn scientists, man. Can't we ever just be satisfied? Always pushing boundaries. Damn it.
And so 16 years later, we get a new study. A very similar experiment,
Nice.
but an even more exciting discovery. Because in this case, this Nova1 gene is definitely unique to humans.
Right.
Neanderthals and Denisovans did not have the same gene either, and it seems to be one of the few genes that pretty much all humans contain. Now here I'm saying almost, because there is a very bizarre discovery. Researchers were able to collect anonymous DNA sequences from approximately 650,000 humans and discovered this gene
That's a
in
lot.
almost everybody except for 6 people. Now,
6?
because these were anonymous, we have no idea who they are, but for some reason, out of
6 out of 600,000, that's like 0.1%, right?
650,000 people,
0.01%.
6 contained a different variant. Obviously, there's
No, it's a lot more than... Oh, it's a very small number.
no explanation why and why they have this mutation, but it would be interesting to find out if this produced any kind of a problem with their speech. But based on the genetic analysis, we know that this gene is relatively new in terms of evolutionary times. Since Neanderthals and Denisovans did not have this gene, it must have evolved after the species split. And based on a thorough genetic analysis, scientists believe that it must have formed only a few 100,000 years ago, possibly even less. And so because of the novelty of this gene, it was obviously somewhat intriguing to discover what effect this has on humans and what effect it might have on these mice. And that's because mice, despite containing a similar gene, do not contain the same gene. This is really uniquely human. And to test this, scientists
I mean, that's where the anonymization is a little bit... It would be a little bit just like frustrating sometimes. I mean, we all know why they do it, but it would be really nice to go back to those 6 people. I wish they had some, or he clarified on, did they go back to the 6 people and did those 6 people have speech impediments? So I'm a little confused right now because there's two different genes he's talking about. One the Neanderthals had, and then this new one they did not, and it's recent. So I'm starting to get a little bit confused by this video.
Scientists created genetic mutations that made these genes exactly the same as human genes, and then conducted two separate experiments, one involving pups and one involving grown-up mice. And even as pups, these mice were already doing something different. Compared to a regular pup, these genetically modified pups were producing frequencies that were much higher. Basically ultrasonic squeaks, but in much higher frequencies than usual. And for some unknown reasons, despite a lot of screaming, their moms seemed to ignore
Dude, they look so cute. This picture looks really cute.
them. Normally, when pups produce ultrasound squeaks, their moms come right away. But here, even at young age, these pups were already producing different sounds and thus communicating a little bit differently. But a much more intriguing discovery came from the mice that were already older. So basically, once these pups grew up and became older, they then went on their first date, or technically had their first courting experience. And surprisingly here,
That's alright, you could have left it as date. That was cute.
during courtship, these genetically modified mice were producing calls that were very different from a regular mouse. And though the frequency was exactly the same, the actual amount of squeaks was extremely different and much more complex. In other words, they were actually making sounds that were way more complex in terms of syllables.
Okay, I hope they have an audio for this. Please have an audio. Please have Dagobin audio. Please, Anton, please.
With the overall communication being longer and more diverse. In other words, I guess in human terms, their pickup lines were very elaborate.
Oh, no, go! I've scared you. I've said too much. I'm hopeless and awkward and desperate for love.
And this is a really bizarre discovery. It really confirms that the mutation in this Nova1 gene is potentially responsible for our ability to communicate with so much complexity and our ability to express so many complex thoughts in so many different ways. And because here this gene could also be tracked inside the brain of the mouse, it definitively confirmed dramatic changes in a lot of different sections.
Damn, now I feel awful, man. What if these poor mice are just sitting there having all of these like philosophical, existential thoughts and debates? You throw them with the regular mouse and they're like, why are we here? What are we doing here? What's the purpose? Poor mice, man.
Especially the ones responsible for communication. And this was a direct and definitive confirmation that Nova1 protein seems to dramatically change vocalization patterns and may indeed be the human language gene, a human-specific gene that literally built our culture. And these bizarre vocalization patterns that were detected in these mice, though preliminary, still seems to suggest that even in these mice the communication became way more complex and much more elaborate. But unfortunately it seems to have failed to impress other mice. In other words, just having this one mutation would obviously not suddenly turn them human. And since the brain analysis confirms that there's a change in the vocal behavior...
But was there a difference in courtship rates? I mean, did it make them more appealing, less appealing, or the same?
area. Right now there's little to doubt that Nova1 was indeed responsible. But in humans, it obviously does so many other things. For example, we know that it also affects learning. And problems with Nova1 have been correlated with various learning disabilities.
I mean, did the mice actually mate? Did they produce offspring? Did they...
Yes. And that's on top of approximately 90 other things it seems to be responsible for. And so basically here, it might not be just a language gene, it might be a gene responsible for a lot of other things that make us human. And something that very likely evolved in early humans and eventually became dominant because it very likely provided a lot of advantage. Advantage in communication, but also possibly things like learning and even understanding the environment. But because this is just the first of such studies, we still have no idea exactly what it does or what other effects it might have inside these mice that were now basically humanized, as the researchers refer to it in this study. And so I'm actually kind of excited to see other studies.
I mean, this is where you kind of look at the current explanation and ideas of random selection, stuff like that, which is true to an extent, but I mean, the fact that mammals have developed like essentially the entire structure for speech, except for this one kill switch. And then in humans, this kill switch was turned off. Or I mean, if you want to make it more intuitive, like an on-off switch, when humans it was turned on. That seems like an awful coincidence. A coinky-dinky. It seems like an awfully big coinky-dinky to me. And, it's not like slight evolutions here and there. I mean, that's a lot of evolution and structure developing in your genes and then leading up to a single on-off switch. And it seems unlikely that just a single on-off switch resulted, like a single gene results in complex speech. It's just interesting. It makes one think. And if it doesn't make one think, then it's a bit surprising. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here.
So these humanized mice, because here this discovery might finally show us the actual genetic mutations that transformed earlier hominids into humans that we are today. And so this is something we'll come back and talk more about in some of the future studies. Until then, check out some of the previous videos on a very similar topic in the description below. Thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves me about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon by joining channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.
Okay, well, so... yeah, I mean, I think you did a good job, but, just to sort of expound on it a little bit, again, it just, you have all of this complex structure built up, and then a single gene, which seems to be a single switch, that's just turned on in humans. I mean, a single gene would not lead to an entirety of speech and complex thought. So it is kind of interesting. I mean, it opens. This is the thing about science, is that you got to be open-minded, and it does make you wonder, like, how did it happen? Why did it happen? Was it just random coincidence? Are there signs in our genes for something else that's going on in the universe? I've been watching a lot and reading a lot recently. That's the upside of having a lot of time on my hands. And the breadth of knowledge that I have ingested has really blown me away, in that there's a lot that's going on in the universe, and even on Earth, that's that I never would have known if I was just a professor stuck in a lab somewhere. So, it ranges from, are these UAPs real, which they seem to be? Are humans actually evolved, or are we created? In some ways, are we a genetic experiment? Is genetic experimentation being done upon us? We don't know for sure. Were humans created for some purpose and then we outlive that purpose? Kind of like iRobot, where we are the robots, So recently when I saw that movie, I couldn't help but feel like, oh, what if we are the robots, and all the way up to the Goldilocks zones of the universe. Like, so much of the universe seems to fall within a Goldilocks zone, and some people propose a multiverse in which there's like an uncountable number of completely dead universes out there, and the only reason we happen to be living in this one because it's the only one that supports life, or one of the few. That is a theory, not a very elegant theory, and not a very likely theory. But then I started learning about quantum biology, and it seems at this stage, from what I read, that the laws of physics themselves seem to be skewed towards consciousness and life. So, for example, with photosynthesis, it appears that a quantum random walk takes place, and in doing so, the probability of a successful transition or a successful tunneling through that barrier is significantly higher than it would be if it was just a random walk. And apparently, a similar phenomenon happens with mutations and random selection in life. In that, when DNA mutates, it seems to skew towards a favorable mutation through a process similar to quantum random walks, where the end result that supports consciousness, and where consciousness is a result, is a measurement, or life is a measurement, collapses the wave function around that, like, one specific path. So it seems that probability is skewed towards life even within our universe. Which doesn't negate that there could be other universes out there in the multiverse that don't have our laws of physics, and the reason why we have life is a 2-for-1, right? We happen to be the only universe that has life, and the reason why it has life is because the laws themselves seem to skew towards consciousness. So, I mean, that's sort of the way it seems right now. And then in this experiment, it would be really nice if they had provided the audio sounds. So, oh well.